The church today, by which I mean both the broader church as well as this and most other congregations, is a very different place than it was when I was ordained now nearly 40 years ago. In one sense, at least, that's not terribly surprising, since almost nothing stays the same over that long a period of time. Pretty much everything has changed over the course of the past 40 years, certainly not just the church. But what is surprising, I think, is the magnitude of the change that has taken place in the church, an institution that traditionally is far more averse to change than most others, and yet may well have changed more and changed more rapidly in recent years than perhaps during any comparable period in its history. For one thing, just to take a single example, when I was ordained in 1980, there was exactly one minister in the presbytery to which I belonged who was a woman. One. Every other minister was male. And needless to say, that is far from the case today. In fact, I think it is very likely in the not-too-distant future that women clergy will be in the majority, at least in the PCUSA, the denomination to which we belong. And I wouldn't be a bit surprised if the next pastor of this church were a woman. But there have been all kinds of changes, some of which may be less immediately obvious than others, but nonetheless have made a substantial difference in our life together as a church. And one of those less obvious changes is one that it's had a big effect on a particular activity that is among the most visible activities in the church, and that is the role that preaching plays in worship. Sermons are very different today than what they used to be. Now, that's not always apparent, but in some ways it is, because part of it is simply a change in speaking style, a change from a very formal and highly declamatory manner of speaking to something much less formal and more conversational. But another change that has taken place, and this is a more substantive change, is something that under any circumstances would have almost inevitably weakened the impact of preaching in the church, even if the sermons themselves had not changed at all. And that is simply a broad decline in biblical literacy among most American Christians. To put it painfully bluntly, people just don't know the Bible anymore. And the Bible is the language of preaching. It's not just that people have suddenly stopped reading the Bible, though I do think the number of people who read the Bible on any kind of regular basis has certainly declined. But the real problem is, I think, the explosion that has taken place in people's access to other sources of information. Access that has simply overwhelmed the traditional means of disseminating biblical knowledge, which today is still largely done the same way it has always been done, which is people reading the book. It's hard to imagine, but it really wasn't all that long ago. The Bible was one of the very few sources of reading material that most people had ready access to. That's changed totally. Today, for most people, the Bible is probably less than 1%, far less than 1%, of the information you access in any given week. So while people may still know bits and pieces of the Bible, particularly those stories that you heard as a child growing up in Sunday school, and stories that then are often repeated around Christmas and Easter, most folks these days generally don't have much knowledge of the broader narrative sweep of the Bible. Just how it is that all of those stories that we do know actually fit together into one whole. Now, it's not that the decline in biblical literacy has had a disturbing effect on, say, the moral character of church members or anything like that. That's not the problem. The problem is that we have lost a vocabulary, a very useful vocabulary that we used to have for looking at and then talking about the world around us, in sermons, for example. And by vocabulary, I mean both the words themselves, but even more so, a distinctive set of ideas that have come down to us through the Bible and its stories, so much so that in the past, many people, certainly including my mother, quite literally viewed the world through the pages of the Bible. And for people like my mother, a sermon then, say, about the Israelites wandering in the wilderness, was not just a story about the Israelites wandering in the wilderness long ago, but a story they quite naturally heard as a commentary on a contemporary events in their own lives, because they saw themselves as characters in the biblical story. They identified with those stories because those stories were, in a very real sense, their story. And that's what's changed, because it's not our story anymore. That same sermon today would just sound like a story about a group of people wandering in the wilderness long ago. At best, perhaps, it might be a mildly entertaining account of events that took place in ancient times. At worst, though, it would be an archaic relic of a primitive time of absolutely no relevance to people's lives today. And that has made a difference. Having lost an important tool, that distinctive biblical vocabulary with which to talk about our world, what's left to us is the vocabulary that is used everywhere else these days, which is a highly politicized vocabulary, resulting in too many sermons that all too often sound more like political campaign speeches than they do anything else, which is one of the reasons, I'm afraid, that the church is in the process right now of splitting continuously along ideological lines, because that's the only language we have anymore. And frankly, I think one of the biggest challenges facing the church today is how to restore a working knowledge of the Bible and its content among church members. And I don't just mean kids in Sunday school, I mean all of us, so that we can reclaim the distinctive language that traditionally was ours, rather than having to use someone else's with all its baggage. Our Old Testament lesson this morning is a good example of the very thing I'm talking about. Here we have a story about Israelites wandering in the wilderness and complaining, as they were wont to do, about the lack of food and water along the way. And they complain continuously to the Lord and to Moses, as they have throughout their journey, to the point that the Lord grows weary of listening to them and sends what our version of the Bible calls poisonous serpents among them to teach them the error of their ways. And sure enough, after a number of them are said to have died from having been bitten, they come back to Moses and repent of their folly. At which point Moses is instructed by the Lord to fashion a bronze serpent, to mount it on top of a pole, and to set that pole up in the midst of their camp. And when anyone then is bitten by one of the aforementioned serpents, he or she is to look upon the serpent up there on the pole, and they will not perish then, but will live. Now, in all likelihood, this story just sounds strange to you. And you're probably asking yourself, at least you should be asking yourself if you listened to it, what on earth is a story like this doing in the Bible? I mean, a story about God sending poisonous serpents to bite everyone who complains, and then Moses erecting what is in effect a totem pole to ward off the effects of the poison. I mean, really? What are we to make of a story like that? And I'll grant you that just taken by itself, it does in fact sound a little bit crazy. Unless you know the rest of the story, in which case it doesn't sound so crazy. It just sounds like another chapter in the larger story, of which this is only one small piece. The larger story where all kinds of things are happening, so that when I read the story, knowing the rest of the story, I don't think this is a crazy story. Actually, what I think is I sure would like to have some of those poisonous serpents when people complain about things. But actually, the text doesn't really say poisonous serpents. It says something more like fiery dragons, but the translators have obviously toned that down to make it sound like something a little more reasonable so that you won't think it's even crazier than it already seems. And that's a problem with a story like this. What do you do with this kind of story? Well, the fact is, there actually is something very interesting about this story. As strange as it may sound to us on first hearing. And what is interesting is that someone, another biblical writer a number of years later, actually reached back and borrowed a verse out of this story. A verse from what is arguably one of the strangest stories in the whole Bible, and then modeled on that verse, that being, make a poisonous serpent and set it on a pole, so that everyone who is bitten shall look at it and live. Modeled on that verse, what is arguably the most famous verse in the whole Bible, that being John 3:16. For God so loved the world that he gave his only Son, so that everyone who believes in him may not die, but have everlasting life. And just in case you don't get the connection, John explicitly compares Jesus being lifted up on the cross with that bronze serpent set on top of that pole, so that people might look upon that and not die, but have life. But why would John do that? Why would he reach back into such a strange story to take a verse that he's going to rewrite and make an expression of the gospel? Why would he take this famous expression of the love that God has for humankind, that God so loved the world, and model it on something as strange as this passage from Numbers? Well, I think what John has done here is to take what even in his own day was this very old, frankly primitive idea. The idea, after all, which is behind totem poles, that merely to look at something is to channel something of that object's power in order to produce some desired effect upon you. He's taken that idea, that archaic idea, and applied a similar kind of logic to the death of Jesus Christ upon the cross. That to look upon the cross on which the Prince of Glory died is to be so transformed by the power of the love of God, love so amazing, so divine, as to pass from death to life everlasting. He's taken this ancient story and he's transformed it into the most powerful expression of the gospel that has ever been written. That God so loved the world that he gave his only Son, that whoever believes in him may not perish, but have eternal life. Which is what you can do when you know the Bible and its stories, and you use that vocabulary to capture a truth that is beyond your ability to say in any other way. Which is why we've got to learn the Bible again.